The foundation of a man's life does not collapse with a deafening crash. It crumbles in the quiet hum of a computer screen on a meaningless Tuesday morning. I always thought the greatest threat to my future would be a sudden failing of my health or a catastrophic market crash. Never the smiling woman sleeping soundly beside me for the last 3 decades. My name is Arthur. I am 62 years old, and for 40 rigorous years, I traded the cartilage in my knees, the strength in my back, and the prime of my youth for a promise. I worked on the floor of a heavy steel fabrication plant, breathing in metallic dust and ozone, working 50, sometimes 60 hours a week. It was brutal, unforgiving labor. It was the kind of work that leaves your hands permanently calloused, your fingernails stained with industrial grease, and your shoulders locked in a perpetual, dull ache. But I did it willingly, and I did it with a quiet, enduring pride. I was not just welding steel beams and operating heavy machinery. I was building a fortress, a financial fortress meant to protect me and my wife, Eleanor, in our twilight years. We had an unspoken contract, or so I foolishly believed. I would provide the sweat, the endless overtime, the missed weekends, and she would build the beautiful life inside the walls I was erecting. We had been married for 30 years, 3 decades of shared anniversaries, quiet Sunday dinners, and what I assumed was absolute, unbreakable trust. Eleanor was always the organized one, the meticulous planner, the keeper of our kingdom's keys. While I was pulling double shifts to ensure our future was ironclad, she managed the present, she paid the utility bills, balanced the household ledgers, and handled all of our investments. I was perfectly content with this arrangement. In fact, I welcomed it. I handed over my paychecks week after week, year after year, trusting her implicitly with the entirety of my existence. Why would I ever doubt her? She was my wife, my chosen partner in this life, the woman who rubbed my aching shoulders when I came home completely depleted. I never once asked to see the bank statements or the quarterly investment reports. I never questioned her when she casually mentioned she was moving funds around to capture better interest rates or setting up new high-yield accounts to maximize our returns. I just nodded, exhausted but deeply grateful that I did not have to navigate the confusing labyrinth of modern finance after a 12-hour shift on the noisy, dangerous factory floor. Looking back with the bitter clarity of hindsight, I should have noticed the subtle, insidious shifts in her behavior. The sudden, unexplained interest in complex banking regulations she claimed she read about in a magazine, or the way she would quickly snap her laptop shut with a startled jump whenever I walked into the den unexpectedly. But love, I have learned the hard way, is often just a very fancy, poetic word for willful blindness. It happened 3 weeks before I was scheduled to officially retire from the plant. The company was planning to throw a small, predictable party for me, complete with a cheap sheet cake and a fake gold watch to commemorate my 4 decades of quiet servitude. I was sitting at the kitchen island, drinking my black morning coffee, staring out the bay window at the morning frost blanketing the front lawn. Eleanor was out running errands, a seemingly innocent Saturday routine that I never second-guessed. Sitting there in the quiet house, a strange, unprompted urge washed over me. Call it a premonition, call it a sudden, overwhelming desire to behold the physical fruits of my lifelong labor before I clocked out for the final time. I wanted to see the number. I wanted to stare at the screen and tangibly see the sum of my existence, the concrete proof that every missed family barbecue, every postponed vacation, and every night spent icing my swollen joints had actually meant something. I wanted to look at the $650,000 we had meticulously accumulated over a lifetime of sacrifice. I stood up, walked down the hallway into the home office, a room I rarely frequented, and sat down at Eleanor's heavy mahogany desk. I opened her sleek, silver laptop. By some twist of fate, she had left her password manager unlocked. A rare and devastatingly careless mistake from a woman who I would very soon learn was dangerously, frighteningly methodical. I clicked on the browser and selected the bookmark for our primary wealth management portal. The loading icon spun on the screen for what felt like an absolute eternity. My heart beat a steady, excited rhythm against my ribs. I was fully expecting a flood of relief, a profound, undeniable sense of accomplishment to wash over me. I was ready to finally exhale after 40 years of holding my breath. Then, the screen resolved. The digital numbers materialized in stark black font against the bright white background. I blinked hard, rubbing my tired eyes, entirely convinced that my aging vision or a temporary computer glitch was playing a cruel trick on me. I leaned closer to the monitor, my breath suddenly hitching in my throat. I looked for the comma. I scanned the page for the 6 digits I knew with absolute certainty had to be there. But there was no comma. There were no 6 digits. The total available balance in our joint life savings account, the massive, sacred account that was supposed to fund our golden years, pay for our future medical care, and ensure we never had to worry about money ever again. Read exactly $412.16. My mind simply refused to process the visual information. $412. I reached out with a trembling hand and hit the refresh button. The screen reloaded in a flash. $412.16. I logged out, my fingers clumsy on the keyboard, and logged back in, praying I had somehow accessed the wrong portal. $412.16. The air in the home office suddenly felt incredibly thin, as if the oxygen had been violently and instantly sucked out through the overhead air vents. A cold, suffocating dread began to pool in the very pit of my stomach, rapidly rising up into my chest, gripping my lungs in an agonizing vice. 40 years of bone-crushing, soul-draining labor, completely erased. Gone. Evaporated into the digital ether as if my life's work had never even existed. I sat there in the deafening silence of my own home, the magnitude of the betrayal pressing down on me with the weight of a collapsed building. The woman I loved, the woman I had trusted with my livelihood and my future, had gutted me from the inside out while smiling to my face. A lesser man might have screamed until his throat bled. A lesser man might have thrown the expensive laptop through the glass window or immediately called the police in a blind, hysterical panic. But as the initial, paralyzing shockwave of absolute devastation washed over me, it was quickly and surprisingly replaced by a terrifying, icy calm. The cold, unyielding steel I had worked with my entire life had finally seeped directly into my veins. She had taken my past and tried to steal my future, but she had made one critical, fatal miscalculation. If she thought I was simply going to roll over, accept my ruin, and quietly fade away into poverty, she had vastly underestimated the man she married. I was not going to scream. I was going to get every single thing I was owed, and she was never going to see it coming. The hardest thing a man can ever do is swallow a scream of absolute betrayal when the thief holding the knife is walking back through the front door. If I confronted her in the heat of that agonizing moment, the dust would settle with me holding nothing but empty pockets and a shattered reality. I heard the familiar hum of her sedan pulling into the driveway, the crunch of gravel under the tires signaling the end of my ignorant bliss. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, but I forced my breathing to slow. I closed the silver laptop, gently wiping away the faint smudge my sweating fingers had left on the pristine casing. I pushed the heavy mahogany chair back into its exact position, making sure the carpet fibers were not disturbed. When Eleanor walked into the kitchen, carrying 2 bags of expensive organic groceries and humming a soft, cheerful tune, I was standing by the sink, washing out my coffee mug. I turned and offered her the same tired, dependable smile I had given her for 3 decades. She kissed my cheek, complaining about the traffic on the interstate and the rising cost of avocados. I listened, nodding along, staring into the eyes of a stranger who had methodically gutted my life. The psychological restraint required to not grab her by the shoulders and demand my money back was a physical agony, a burning acid in my throat, but I knew that rage was a useless currency. Information, however, was power. The next afternoon presented the perfect window. Eleanor kissed me goodbye, adjusting her silk scarf, and announced she was heading out to a charity luncheon with the local historical society. She warned me she would be gone for at least 4 hours. The moment her car turned the corner at the end of our street, my silent, methodical investigation began. I marched straight into the home office and locked the door behind me, a precaution in case she forgot something, and turned around. I started with the obvious places. I rifled through the deep drawers of her desk, carefully memorizing the placement of every pen and notepad so I could leave no trace of my intrusion. I flipped through the neat, color-coded folders in the filing cabinet. Everything appeared perfectly mundane. Paid utility bills, insurance policies, warranties for kitchen appliances. It was a masterclass in domestic camouflage. But I was a man who spent his life building things from the ground up, inspecting welds and structural integrity. I knew how to look for the hidden faults. I moved to the closet in the corner of the room, a space crammed with dusty boxes of holiday decorations and old, heavy winter coats. I pulled everything out, stacking the plastic bins quietly on the carpet. At the very back, tucked flush against the baseboard and completely concealed behind 2 heavy cardboard boxes labeled with tax years from a decade ago, sat a dark gray, fireproof lockbox. It was heavy, industrial, and decidedly out of place in Eleanor's meticulously curated home office. It had a simple combination dial, but I had zero intention of guessing her numbers. I walked out to my pickup truck, retrieved a solid steel pry bar and a heavy flathead screwdriver from my rusted toolbox, and returned to the office. I wedged the flathead into the seam of the lockbox lid, applied the steady, immense pressure I had developed over 40 years of manual labor, and leaned my weight into it. The cheap metal latch snapped with a sharp, satisfying crack. Inside the box lay the autopsy of my marriage. I reached in with trembling, grease-stained fingers and pulled out a thick stack of bank statements. They were from an institution we had never used, printed on crisp, high-quality paper. The account was in her name alone. I scanned the columns of numbers, my stomach plummeting with every line. There it was, the systematic bleeding of my life savings. It had not happened overnight. It had started 5 years ago with small, innocuous transfers of a few $1,000s here and there, masked as home repairs or medical copays. Then, the numbers grew bolder. $10,000, $25,000. Finally, just 3 months ago, a massive wire transfer of over $400,000 completely draining our joint accounts and funneled directly into this hidden vault. But she had not kept the money there. The outgoing transfers from this secret account painted a far more devastating picture. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had been wired to a single, recurring recipient. The name printed on the ledger made my blood run instantly cold. Marcus Vance. Marcus was Eleanor's high school sweetheart, a man she briefly dated 4 decades ago, a slick, silver-tongued local boy who had moved to the West Coast to chase failed business ventures. She had always claimed they simply reconnected on social media a few years ago to share innocent memories and harmless updates about their aging parents. I had believed her, trusting in the solid foundation of our vows. But the paper trail in my hands proved that their innocent chats had blossomed into a highly lucrative, entirely predatory romance. I was bankrolling a man who had not worked an honest day in his life, funding his debts and his desires with the literal sweat off my back. Beneath the damning bank statements lay a sleek, black burner smartphone. I pressed the power button, holding my breath. It was not locked with a passcode. The battery was at 70%. I opened the messaging application and found exactly one active conversation thread. The contact name was simply saved as an emoji of a black heart. I sat cross-legged on the floor of the office, surrounded by discarded tax boxes, and read 3 years of digital betrayal. The messages were sickeningly sweet, filled with promises of a beautiful, wealthy future together, entirely funded by the stupid, trusting factory worker who was completely oblivious to his own ruin. They mocked my long hours. They joked about my exhaustion. Every message was a dagger twisted slowly in my back. But the final exchange, dated just 2 days ago, provided the absolute masterpiece of her deception. Eleanor had been talking about her upcoming trip to Italy for the better part of a year. She framed it as a necessary, month-long solo journey of self-discovery, a chance to paint watercolors in the Tuscan countryside and find her inner peace before we officially entered our retirement years. I had encouraged her to go, wanting her to be happy, thinking she deserved a beautiful reward after putting up with my grueling schedule for so long. The messages on the burner phone revealed the true itinerary. It was not a solo journey of self-discovery. It was a lavish, deeply romantic getaway for two. First-class tickets, a luxury villa overlooking the Amalfi Coast, private boat charters, and endless wine tours. She was meeting Marcus in Rome. The plan, spelled out in agonizing, explicit detail in their texts, was for her to return from Italy, claim she had an epiphany about our marriage, file for a clean divorce, and take half of whatever pathetic scraps were left in our legitimate accounts, walking away clean while I scrambled to survive on a meager pension. She thought she had thought of every possible contingency, but she left one massive, glaring blind spot in her grand exit strategy. I stared at the glossy Italian itinerary she had carelessly left folded inside the firebox, a slow, dark realization forming about how I could use her dream vacation to completely dismantle her reality. I carefully took high-resolution photographs of every single document, every bank transfer, and every damning text message using my own phone. I backed the images up to a secure, cloud-based server she did not even know existed. Then, I meticulously placed the burner phone and the statements back into the gray firebox. I closed the lid, pressing down hard until the broken latch caught just enough to look secure from a casual glance. I restacked the heavy cardboard tax boxes perfectly, vacuumed the carpet to remove any trace of drywall dust from my pry bar, and unlocked the office door. By the time Eleanor returned from her charity luncheon, carrying a half-eaten box of expensive artisan pastries and complaining about the boring speeches, the house was perfectly spotless. I was sitting in my worn leather recliner, watching a documentary about deep-sea fishing, sipping a glass of iced tea. She smiled brightly, a picture of perfect, loving innocence, and asked how my afternoon was. I looked at the woman who had stolen my life, the woman who was currently packing designer sundresses purchased with my blood and sweat, and I smiled back. My afternoon was highly educational. I told her quietly. I had lost my entire life savings. My marriage was a grotesque 30-year lie, and the woman I loved was actively plotting my absolute destruction. But as I sat there, listening to her chatter happily about her upcoming flight, the agonizing pain in my chest finally crystallized into something entirely different. It hardened into a cold, diamond-sharp weapon. I was going to let her get on that plane. I was going to kiss her goodbye and wish her a beautiful trip. And then, the very second the wheels of her airplane left the tarmac, I was going to burn her stolen kingdom entirely to the ground. There is a very specific, suffocating kind of hell that exists when you are forced to share a dinner table with your own executioner. Every casual conversation, every shared smile over a plate of roasted chicken feels exactly like swallowing jagged pieces of broken glass. For the next 14 days, I became a master-class actor in a stage play where I was the only one who knew the script was a tragedy. I woke up at the same early hour, brewed the same dark roast coffee, and kissed Eleanor on the cheek with the same mechanical affection I had displayed for 3 decades. But beneath my weathered skin, my blood ran at an absolute freezing zero. Watching her glide through our kitchen, humming softly as she flipped through travel magazines, was a psychological torture I would not wish upon my worst enemy. She would sit across from me in the evenings, sipping expensive red wine paid for by my vanished retirement fund, and weave elaborate, beautiful lies about her need for a spiritual reset in the Tuscan hills. She spoke at length about finding her center, about reconnecting with her youthful spirit, and about how this month away would ultimately make our marriage stronger for our golden years. I nodded. I smiled. I even offered to look up local painting classes for her in Florence, forcing my voice to remain perfectly steady while my mind visualized the damning text messages I had photographed in her hidden lockbox. The true test of my endurance came during the final weekend before her departure. Eleanor brought out her matching set of heavy, leather-bound designer luggage, another luxury purchase she claimed she had saved up for using her own modest allowance. I knew the truth now. My calloused hands had welded the steel that paid for those bags. Yet, I knelt on the bedroom floor beside her, diligently folding her expensive silk blouses, her new evening dresses, and the surprisingly sheer lingerie she claimed was just for making her feel confident. The sheer audacity of it all was almost breathtaking. I was actively, physically helping my wife pack for a lavish, romantic getaway with the man who was currently living off my stolen life savings. When she thanked me, wrapping her arms around my neck and pressing her cheek against mine, telling me how lucky she was to have such an understanding and supportive husband, I had to close my eyes and vividly picture the $412 left in my bank account just to stop my hands from trembling. But those quiet, excruciating moments of domestic servitude were simply the cover for my true work. While she spent her afternoons getting manicures and picking up last-minute travel accessories, I was sitting in my worn leather recliner, staring at the walls of the home we had shared, formulating the absolute foundation of my retaliation. Eleanor had been brutally thorough in draining our liquid assets, but in her arrogant rush to secure her wealthy future with Marcus, she had completely overlooked the largest, most valuable piece on the entire chessboard. She had spent the last 30 years picking my pockets, but she forgot to look at the ground beneath her feet. This house, a sprawling, 4-bedroom colonial sitting on 2 acres of prime suburban real estate, was never hers. It had belonged to my grandfather, a stoic, hard-working man who had built it brick by brick shortly after returning from the war. When he passed away, 2 years before I even met Eleanor, he left the property entirely to me. It was a clear, uncontested inheritance. Because of the specific laws in our state, and because I had explicitly refused to ever put her name on the original deed out of a stubborn sense of family pride, the house remained my sole, separate property. She had tried, over the years, to gently suggest we refinance and put both our names on the mortgage, claiming it was just standard procedure for married couples. But the house was paid off long ago, and my grandfather's voice had always echoed in my head, warning me to keep the family land in the family name. I had held firm, and Eleanor, perhaps fearing that pushing too hard would arouse suspicion, had eventually dropped the subject. It was a crucial, devastating legal loophole that she had simply dismissed as irrelevant to her grand plan. She assumed that, upon her return, when she finally filed the divorce papers, a judge would simply force the sale of the house and award her half the equity as part of a standard asset division. She believed the house was her ultimate safety net, the final payout she would extract from my ruined life before riding off into the sunset with her lover. She thought she had stripped me of everything, completely forgetting the solid, unshakable foundation she had been sleeping on for 3 decades. I spent hours reviewing the original property deeds, consulting state property laws on secure library computers so no search history would ever appear on our home network, and confirming my absolute, unilateral right to dispose of the property exactly as I saw fit. I did not need her permission. I did not need her signature. I did not even need her to be in the country. The plan that slowly crystallized in my mind was as simple as it was ruthlessly efficient. She had stolen my 40 years of labor to fund a new life. I was going to sell the very roof over her head, take every single penny of the equity, and vanish into thin air before she even ordered her first glass of wine on the flight back home. I knew that once she boarded that plane, her carefully constructed timeline would become the exact weapon I used to destroy her completely. I watched her zip up the final suitcase, securing the shiny brass locks with a satisfied sigh. She stood up, brushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead, and smiled down at me. She told me she was going to miss me terribly, but that this trip was exactly what she needed to finally find herself. I stood up, taking her hands in my rough, calloused palms, and looked deeply into the eyes of the woman who had already murdered our future. I told her I agreed completely, and that I was absolutely certain this trip was going to change her life forever. The scent of her expensive floral perfume lingered heavily in the cab of my rusted pickup truck, a sickeningly sweet reminder of the poison sitting comfortably in the passenger seat beside me. We were driving down the interstate toward the international airport, and with every passing mile marker, the heavy iron gate of my carefully laid trap was inching closer to slamming completely shut. The morning sun was painfully bright, casting long shadows across the highway as I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my calloused knuckles turned stark white. Eleanor chattered endlessly, her voice a bright, melodic chirp as she detailed her flight connections and the length of her layover in Paris before finally reaching Rome. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead, offering agreeable grunts and polite, encouraging nods at all the appropriate intervals. Pulling up to the chaotic departure terminal, I shifted the truck into park and stepped out into the humid air. I hoisted her 2 heavy, leather-bound suitcases onto the concrete pavement, feeling the literal weight of her vanity and my stolen labor in my hands. She adjusted her silk travel scarf, turned to me, and wrapped her arms around my neck, pressing her cheek gently against my chest. "I will call you the very second I land," she whispered, her voice dripping with a flawless, counterfeit affection. "Take good care of the house for me. Arthur." I looked down at her, memorizing the face of the woman who had methodically robbed me blind over the course of 5 years. And I smiled, a warm, gentle smile. "Do not worry about a single thing here," I replied, ensuring my voice remained perfectly steady and reassuring. "I am going to take care of absolutely everything." She beamed, kissed my rough cheek one final time, and turned away. I stood by the idling truck and watched her walk through the sliding glass doors, her designer heels clicking excitedly on the polished floor. She never looked back. The drive back to our quiet suburban street felt entirely different than the drive there. The oppressive, suffocating weight of my 30-year masquerade, the agonizing tension of sharing meals with a smiling thief, had lifted the very second her boarding pass was scanned. I walked through the heavy oak front door of my grandfather's house, and the deep silence that greeted me was not lonely in the slightest. It was profoundly liberating. I stood alone in the grand foyer, breathing in the familiar, comforting scent of lemon furniture polish and old wood, allowing myself a sudden, sharp pang of sorrow for the sanctuary I was about to sacrifice. My grandfather had built these sturdy walls with his own bare hands after returning from the war to shelter his family. And now, I was going to use those very same walls to utterly crush the parasite that had infested our lives. She genuinely thought she had 30 uninterrupted days to orchestrate my final financial ruin from the balcony of a luxury villa in Italy. But she had severely underestimated the sheer speed and ruthlessness of a man who suddenly had absolutely nothing left to lose. I bypassed the pristine kitchen and marched straight into the home office, completely ignoring the locked gray firebox hidden in the closet. I did not need to uncover any more of her ugly secrets. I needed to hire a shark. During those agonizing 2 weeks of playing the doting, oblivious husband, I had spent my sleepless nights quietly researching predatory real estate firms on a cheap, prepaid mobile phone I had purchased with physical cash from a convenience store. I was not looking for a friendly, neighborhood real estate agent who would want to stage the dining room, host open houses with warm cookies, and wait 6 agonizing months for a young couple to secure bank financing. I needed cold, hard, untraceable velocity. I had found a massive corporate investment group, a ruthless firm known for plastering aggressive advertisements on highway billboards and late-night television, promising to buy properties exactly as they stood, with 0 contingencies, and closing the deal in less than 7 days. I sat at Eleanor's mahogany desk, pulled out my burner phone, and dialed the local acquisition manager. I kept the conversation incredibly brief and entirely devoid of emotion. I explained that I held a free and clear title to a prime piece of real estate in a highly coveted school district, that the property was completely unencumbered by any mortgage, and that I was highly motivated to liquidate the asset immediately. The man on the other end of the line practically salivated through the receiver, We scheduled a mandatory walkthrough for that exact same afternoon. Just 2 hours later, a silver luxury sedan pulled into my driveway, tires crunching over the gravel. A young man in a sharp, tailored blue suit stepped out, carrying a sleek leather folio and wearing the confident, predatory smile of a salesman who thought he was about to steal a valuable house from a desperate, aging factory worker. He introduced himself as a senior acquisition specialist and immediately began his practiced routine. He walked briskly through the spacious living room, tapping the original hardwood floors with the toe of his expensive shoe, making minor, dismissive comments about the slightly dated kitchen cabinets and the age of the roofing shingles. It was standard, transparent negotiation theater, specifically designed to lower my expectations and justify an insulting initial offer. I let him talk. I followed him silently from room to room, watching his eyes dart around as he mentally calculated his massive profit margins. When we finally returned to the kitchen, he opened his leather folio, clicked his expensive pen, and casually suggested a cash offer of $500,000, citing the supposed need for extensive modernization and structural updates. I leaned back against the cool marble countertop, crossed my arms over my chest, and stared directly into his arrogant eyes. I told him in a quiet, dangerous voice that I was not born yesterday, and I was certainly not a man drowning in debt looking for a pathetic life raft. I laid out the indisputable facts. The foundation was solid steel and poured concrete, built by a master craftsman to outlast a hurricane. The lot was a full 2 acres of perfectly manicured, flat land in a wealthy neighborhood where lesser houses were currently selling for well over $1 million. I looked at him and delivered my non-negotiable terms in a flat, unyielding tone. I demanded exactly $800,000, paid entirely in certified cash funds, to be transferred directly into an account of my choosing within 7 days. There would be absolutely no structural inspections, no mandatory repairs, no professional appraisals, and 0 public listings on any real estate network. A ghost transaction. If he agreed to those exact terms right now, the house was his. If he hesitated for even a single second, I promised him I would immediately call his biggest corporate competitor. The young man swallowed hard, the arrogant, practiced smirk dropping entirely from his face as he realized he was not dealing with a gullible victim, but a man made of the same cold steel he used to forge a living. He excused himself, stepping out onto the back patio to make a quick, hushed phone call to his superiors, his voice an urgent whisper against the afternoon breeze. 5 minutes later, he returned to the kitchen, extended his perfectly manicured hand, and agreed to my exact price without another word of argument. We shook on it, sealing the fate of my grandfather's legacy and Eleanor's stolen future in one firm grip. The corporate shark left my driveway fully believing he had just secured the easiest, most lucrative deal of his entire quarter. He had no earthly idea he had just purchased a loaded bomb, and the countdown clock was already ticking rapidly toward the exact moment my deceitful wife tried to turn her shiny brass key in the front door. There is a profound, unsettling ghostliness to a house when you begin systematically erasing the person who was supposed to grow old inside it. The walls of my grandfather's home had absorbed 30 years of our supposed shared life, but I was about to scrub her memory from every single floorboard. I needed her belongings entirely gone before the corporate buyers returned with their final paperwork, ensuring she would have absolutely nothing to anchor her to the life she had stolen. I drove down to the local hardware store and purchased 50 identical, cheap cardboard moving boxes and a single roll of heavy packing tape. I did not buy bubble wrap. I did not buy protective foam peanuts or specialized wardrobe cartons. The woman who had meticulously drained $400,000 of my blood and sweat from our bank accounts did not deserve the dignity of careful preservation. I started in the master bedroom, standing before the massive walk-in closet we had shared for 3 decades. It was a stark visual representation of our marriage. My side consisted of a dozen faded flannel work shirts, 4 pairs of heavy denim jeans, and a single, outdated dark gray suit I wore to funerals. Her side was an opulent, overflowing boutique of designer labels, fine cashmere, and rows upon rows of expensive leather shoes. I grabbed the first cardboard box, unfolded it, and aggressively taped the bottom shut with a loud, tearing rip that echoed off the high ceilings. I did not fold anything. I reached into her side of the closet and began pulling garments off their velvet hangers by the handful. Silk dresses, wool winter coats, and delicate linen slacks were indiscriminately shoved into the cheap brown boxes. With every armful of expensive fabric I tossed into the cardboard. A heavy, suffocating weight lifted slightly from my chest. This was not just a physical chore. It was a deeply emotional, strangely cathartic exorcism. I was boxing up 30 years of lies. I was packing away the counterfeit smiles, the forced affection, and the silent, parasitic drain on my very existence. When I reached her jewelry box, a heavy, ornate wooden chest sitting on her vanity, I felt a sharp, bitter sting of genuine anger. Inside lay the diamond anniversary tennis bracelet I had purchased for her after working 70-hour weeks for an entire summer. Next to it sat the heavy gold necklace she claimed she bought on sale, which I now knew was funded by the secret transfers to her hidden account. I dumped the entire velvet-lined tray directly into a box, listening to the precious metals and gemstones clatter harshly against the cardboard bottom. I taped it shut and grabbed a thick black permanent marker, scrawling her name across the top in jagged, furious letters. I moved systematically through every single room of my grandfather's house, a silent, relentless ghost hunting down any trace of Eleanor. I stripped the bathroom counters of her overpriced imported face creams and fragrant bath oils, tossing them into boxes alongside her monogrammed towels. I marched into the kitchen and packed up the expensive, single-use gourmet cooking gadgets she had insisted we needed but had never actually used. I took down the framed photographs lining the hallway walls, removing the smiling pictures of our anniversary dinners and holiday parties. I stared at her frozen, happy face behind the glass for a long moment, marveling at the terrifying capacity of a human being to look so purely loving while holding a dagger perfectly steady behind their back. I threw the frames into a box, hearing the glass shatter against the heavy metal of her kitchen appliances. I did not care. By the time the sun began to set, casting long, orange shadows across the hardwood floors, the grand house felt drastically different. Her side of the closet was entirely bare, leaving only dusty echoes and the faint indentations of her shoe racks on the carpet. The vanity was stripped of her presence. The walls were blank. I had successfully reduced a 30-year marriage and an opulent, stolen lifestyle into 35 cheap, uniform cardboard boxes sitting squarely in the center of the living room. The next morning, I loaded the boxes into the rusted bed of my pickup truck, securing them tightly with heavy canvas tarps. I drove away from the wealthy, manicured suburbs and headed toward the dusty, forgotten outskirts of the city. I bypassed the clean, brightly lit storage facilities with their fancy security gates and climate-controlled lobbies. Instead, I pulled into a dilapidated, gravel-paved lot surrounded by a rusting chain-link fence. It was a cheap, run-down facility primarily used by people who had run out of luck and out of options. It was the perfect temporary holding cell for a ruined queen. I walked into the cramped, poorly lit rental office and spoke to a bored teenager behind a scratched plexiglass window. I rented a tiny 10 by 10 foot unit with a heavy corrugated metal door. I registered the rental agreement entirely under Eleanor's legal name, using the address of my grandfather's house, which would soon belong to complete strangers. When the teenager asked for payment, I handed over exactly $150 in cash. I intentionally prepaid for exactly 30 days of rental time. The 30-day timeline was not an accident. It was a perfectly calculated fuse that would burn out the exact moment she realized her Italian lover was only interested in her stolen wealth. By the time she returned from her lavish, deceitful vacation, the prepaid month would be over. The facility management would slap a heavy, bright red padlock on the metal door, demanding late fees and threatening to auction off her designer wardrobe to the highest bidder if she did not produce immediate cash. Cash she would no longer possess. I backed my truck up to the assigned unit, the tires kicking up a cloud of gray dust. The rusted metal door shrieked in protest as I hauled it upward. The space inside smelled faintly of mildew and old concrete. It was perfectly miserable. For the next 2 hours, I worked in the sweltering heat, my work shirt soaked with sweat, hauling the heavy cardboard boxes one by one from the truck bed into the dark, windowless tomb. I stacked them haphazardly, not caring if the heavier boxes crushed the fragile items beneath them. When the truck bed was finally completely empty, I stood in the doorway of the storage unit, staring at the physical manifestation of her life. 30 years of marriage, a mountain of deceit, and hundreds of thousands of stolen dollars, all reduced to a pathetic pile of cheap cardboard sitting in a dirty metal box on the wrong side of town. I pulled the corrugated door down, the metal slamming against the concrete floor with a heavy, final thud. I slipped a thick brass padlock through the latch and snapped it firmly shut. I pocketed the single silver key, knowing exactly where I was going to leave it for her to eventually find. I climbed back into my truck, the worn vinyl seat feeling surprisingly comfortable, and drove away from the gravel lot without looking back in the rearview mirror. The physical erasure of my wife was entirely complete. The house was now a hollow, empty shell, completely devoid of her expensive perfume and her counterfeit smiles. It was ready for the corporate wolves to come in and strip it down to the studs. I drove back toward the suburbs, a profound, undeniable sense of momentum building in my chest. I had successfully cleared the battlefield, and now it was time to finalize the absolute destruction of her financial safety net before she even finished her first glass of Tuscan wine. Signing away the only home you have ever known should feel like a funeral, but sitting in that sterile downtown conference room, I felt only the dangerous thrill of a man holding a lit match over a powder keg. The corporate real estate firm moved with a terrifying, mechanical efficiency, completely bypassing the traditional, exhausting dance of home inspections, open houses, and public listings. They were predators who smelled blood in the water. Assuming my desperate need for a 7-day closing meant I was drowning in hidden debts or running from the law, I let them believe whatever narrative made them work faster. For 3 consecutive days, I lived in a surreal blur of tense, high-speed meetings. I sat across wide, polished mahogany tables from aggressive lawyers in sharp, tailored suits, exhausted escrow agents drinking bitter coffee, and meticulous title company clerks who stamped documents with relentless rhythm. They pushed massive stacks of dense, incomprehensible legal paperwork toward me, clearly expecting me to be intimidated by the fine print and the blindingly rapid pace of the transaction. But they severely underestimated the man sitting quietly across from them. I had spent 40 years of my life reading complex structural blueprints, navigating union contracts, and understanding the precise tolerances of load-bearing steel. A stack of real estate contracts was nothing compared to a factory floor safety audit. I read every single line of the closing documents, tracing the legal jargon with my grease-stained finger. I made absolutely certain that my grandfather's name, and my subsequent sole ownership of the property, protected me completely and entirely from any spousal consent laws in our jurisdiction. In our state, inherited property kept completely separate from marital assets remained the sole dominion of the heir, because I had stubbornly refused to ever add her name to the deed. Eleanor had zero legal standing to stop the sale, even if she had been standing right there in the room with us. Instead, she was halfway across the world, sipping expensive Italian wine and laughing with the man she was currently funding with my stolen sweat, entirely oblivious to the fact that her ultimate safety net was being legally shredded into confetti. The final morning of the escrow period arrived with a heavy, ominous thunderstorm rolling over the city skyline. It was a perfect, cinematic reflection of the absolute devastation I was about to unleash upon my deceitful wife. I sat perfectly still in a leather chair as the lead attorney. A man who charged more per hour than I used to make in a week picked up his desk phone to confirm the final wire transfer. I watched the digital screen on his laptop pivot toward me. $800,000 in clean, untraceable, certified cash had successfully cleared into the title company's temporary holding account. Seeing that number, a sum greater than the life savings Eleanor had meticulously drained from me, sent a profound, electric shock down my spine. But I was not about to leave that massive, life-altering sum sitting in a vulnerable domestic bank account. A clever, vicious divorce lawyer could eventually locate a standard local account, freeze the assets, or lay claim to them during protracted, agonizing litigation when Eleanor inevitably returned and declared war. I had spent the evenings of her packing phase anticipating this exact vulnerability. I had already taken the liberty of contacting a specialized financial advisor and establishing a highly secure, heavily encrypted offshore trust account. It was legally situated in a jurisdiction that explicitly ignored foreign civil judgments and divorce decrees. With a single, decisive nod to the escrow officer, and a few keystrokes on a secure terminal, the entire $800,000 effectively vanished from the United States banking system. It was instantly swallowed by a digital vault that Eleanor could never track, subpoena, or touch. No matter how many expensive attorneys she hired, her grand, final payout was gone forever. I wondered briefly, a cold smile touching the corners of my mouth, how her lover Marcus would react when his personal bank realized the endless fountain of stolen wealth had permanently dried up. The corporate buyers I had contracted had an incredibly lucrative and interesting business model. They did not just hoard the properties they acquired, they often acted as aggressive, off-market acquisition agents for wealthy clients seeking immediate relocation into highly desirable school districts. Because of this, the final handover of the property was not to a faceless corporation, but to the actual people who would live within those walls. That afternoon, the rain finally broke, and I met the end buyers at the front porch of my grandfather's house for the final, official walkthrough. They were a young, eager family. The husband carried a sleeping toddler on his hip, and the wife rested her hand gently on her visibly pregnant stomach. She had bright, hopeful eyes as she looked up at the sturdy oak front door and the solid brick facade that my grandfather had laid with his own hands. They were completely, blissfully unaware of the bitter domestic warfare, the locked fireboxes, and the 30 years of elaborate deceit that had preceded their rapid, cash-funded purchase. To them, this was not a battlefield. They just saw a beautiful, historic home in a pristine neighborhood, a perfectly blank canvas for their new life to unfold. I walked them slowly through the empty, echoing rooms, my boots clicking softly on the bare hardwood floors where Eleanor's expensive rugs used to lie. I showed them the minor quirks of the old plumbing in the guest bathroom, the hidden storage space tucked neatly under the basement stairs, and the precise way you had to jiggle the handle on the back patio door to get it to lock securely. I saw the pure, unadulterated joy on their faces as they mentally arranged their furniture in the spacious living room. It was a stark, almost painful contrast to the toxic, greedy energy that had infested this house for the last decade of my marriage. When we finally returned to the front porch, the afternoon sun breaking through the gray clouds, I reached deep into the pocket of my denim jeans. I pulled out the heavy brass keys that had weighed down my keychain for exactly 32 years. I looked at the worn and grooves in the metal, a physical testament to the thousands of times I had unlocked that door, believing I was stepping into a sanctuary of love and mutual respect. I dropped the heavy keys into the young father's waiting palm, feeling the cold metal completely leave my calloused skin. I told them to take excellent care of the place, to fill it with honesty and genuine warmth. They promised me they would, thanking me profusely for such a smooth, incredibly fast, and straightforward transaction. I stepped off the wooden porch and began the long walk down the winding gravel driveway for the final time. The air smelled sharply of wet asphalt, crushed pine needles, and the distinct, metallic tang of an approaching autumn. Every single step I took away from that house felt like shedding a massive, suffocating layer of heavy iron armor. I had honestly expected to feel a profound sense of loss, a lingering sorrow for abandoning the physical legacy my grandfather had built to protect his bloodline. But as I reached the end of the driveway and opened the heavy, creaking door of my rusted pickup truck, The only emotion coursing through my tired veins was a pure, overwhelming, and absolute sense of liberation. I was a 62-year-old man who had just effectively erased a 30-year mistake with surgical precision. I had clawed back my financial independence from the gaping jaws of absolute ruin, securing my future with a fortress of untraceable cash. More importantly, I had orchestrated a flawless, legally ironclad retaliation against the very woman who had smiled in my face while secretly plotting to bury me in poverty. I slid into the driver's seat, resting my rough hands on the worn steering wheel, and looked back at the house one last time through the rearview mirror. The young family was already standing in the large front window, the wife pointing excitedly at the expansive front lawn, imagining where they would plant a new garden. Eleanor's stolen kingdom belonged to complete strangers now. Her sanctuary was completely gone, sold out from under her feet while she drank champagne in the sky. All that remained for me to do was to pack my essential tools, vanish completely off the grid, and leave her the map to her own agonizing destruction. I needed to craft a final, unforgiving message that would ensure she understood exactly who had engineered her absolute downfall, and that every ounce of her suffering was entirely her own fault. A man never truly realizes how little he actually needs to survive until he is forced to pack his entire remaining existence into the rusted bed of a single pickup truck. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a deep orange glow over the driveway as I loaded the final few items I was taking with me into my new life. Unlike my wife, whose identity was entirely wrapped up in silk dresses and imported leather, my physical footprint was incredibly small. I packed my heavy canvas duffel bag with 5 days' worth of sturdy clothing, my thick winter boots, and the worn, faded denim jacket I had owned since my 20s. Next came my heavy steel toolbox, the very same one I had carried onto the factory floor for 4 decades. Inside were the wrenches, hammers, and measuring tapes that had honestly earned the money she had so effortlessly stolen. They were the only things of real, tangible value I cared to keep. Before I could finally start the engine and leave the suburbs behind forever, there was one final, crucial piece of business to attend to. I sat on the lowered tailgate of my truck, the cool evening air settling around me, and pulled a plain white envelope and a yellow legal pad from my jacket pocket. I needed to leave a map for the monster. I needed Eleanor to understand that her absolute ruin was not a stroke of bad luck or a random universe balancing the scales, but a meticulously engineered consequence of her own greed. I clicked my pen and began to write. My handwriting, usually a hurried, messy scrawl, was suddenly perfectly neat and entirely deliberate. I did not waste ink on emotional outbursts or dramatic declarations of a broken heart. I wrote a cold, clinical autopsy of her betrayal. I detailed the exact date I discovered the $412 balance in our joint account. I mentioned the hidden firebox, the burner phone, and the sick, mocking messages exchanged with Marcus Vance. I told her I knew the supposed solo journey of self-discovery in Italy was nothing more than a lavish romantic getaway funded by my sweat and my blood. I wanted her to read those words and feel the exact same suffocating panic I had felt sitting in her home office just 3 weeks prior. Then, I laid out the financial reality of her new situation. I explained, in very clear, undeniable terms, that because my grandfather had left the house solely in my name, I possessed the unilateral legal right to sell it out from under her, which I had done exactly 7 days after her departure. I informed her that the $800,000 in pure cash equity was currently sitting in an untraceable offshore trust, far beyond the reach of any divorce lawyer she might desperately try to hire. Finally, I explained the key. I slid the single silver storage unit key into the envelope, writing down the address of the gravel lot on the outskirts of town. I explicitly told her that 30 years of her vanity and designer labels were currently sitting in a damp metal box, and that the prepaid rental agreement would expire just days after she landed. If she wanted her clothes, she would have to find a way to pay the delinquent fees without a single dime of my money. I sealed the envelope, pressing the adhesive down firmly. I walked up the porch steps, past the young family who was currently unpacking boxes in the living room and taped the envelope squarely to the center of the heavy oak front door. It was the absolute first thing she would see when her key failed to turn the new locks. I climbed into the driver's seat of my truck, turned the key in the ignition, and listened to the familiar, comforting roar of the engine. I pulled out of the driveway, the gravel crunching under my tires, and merged onto the darkened highway. I drove for 3 solid days. I crossed state lines, leaving the congested, wealthy suburbs far behind me, driving deep into the rugged, pine-covered mountains of the Pacific Northwest. I did not listen to the radio. I just listened to the hum of the tires against the asphalt, feeling a profound, incredible sense of peace wash over me with every passing mile. A decade ago, after working a massive string of double shifts, I had quietly purchased a tiny, dilapidated fisherman's cabin sitting on a remote, rocky coastline. It was meant to be a surprise retirement gift for Eleanor, a quiet, romantic retreat where we could spend our final years watching the waves crash against the shore. She had always complained about the ocean air ruining her hair, so I had kept it a secret, planning to slowly renovate it into a modern, comfortable sanctuary before revealing it to her. Now, that secret purchase was my ultimate salvation. It was a property completely detached from our main finances, purchased with a small, private inheritance from an uncle that I had never bothered to mention. She had no earthly idea it existed. I arrived at the cabin just as the morning fog was rolling in off the freezing ocean. It was small, weathered gray by the salt and the wind, and completely isolated from the rest of the world. The nearest neighbor was over 5 miles away down a treacherous dirt road. I unlocked the simple wooden door and stepped inside. It smelled of cedar wood and damp earth. It was absolutely perfect. My first order of business was completely severing the cord to my past. I took the smartphone I had used for the last 5 years, the one filled with photos of a counterfeit marriage, walked out to the rocky cliff face, and hurled it as far as I could into the churning gray water below. I watched it sink beneath the foam, taking every digital tie I had to Eleanor with it. I had already purchased a cheap, prepaid mobile phone with a brand new, unlisted number, which I would only use for absolute emergencies. I had no internet connection. I had no social media. I was effectively a ghost. I spent the next 2 weeks settling into my new rhythm. I woke up with the sun, drank black coffee on the wooden porch while watching the fishing boats bob on the horizon, and spent my days repairing the rotting floorboards and weatherproofing the windows with my own tools. The physical labor was deeply satisfying. Every nail I drove, every piece of wood I sanded, felt like I was rebuilding my own soul from the ground up. I was no longer laboring to fund a thief's lavish lifestyle. I was working entirely for myself. But even in the profound, quiet beauty of my coastal isolation, my mind frequently drifted back to the calendar tacked to the kitchen wall. Every evening, I would take a thick black marker and cross off another day. I was tracking the exact timeline of her Italian vacation. I knew the precise hour her return flight was scheduled to touch down on the tarmac. I knew how long it would take her to collect her matching leather luggage from the baggage carousel. And I knew exactly how much an overpriced airport taxi would charge to drive her back to the quiet suburban street she believed was still her kingdom. The trap was fully set, the bait had been taken, and the steel jaws were completely locked into place. I sat on my weathered porch, wrapped in my heavy denim jacket against the chilling sea breeze, and stared out at the dark, vast ocean. The absolute hardest part of this entire endeavor was the agonizing wait. I had orchestrated a masterpiece of financial and emotional retaliation, but I was going to be thousands of miles away when the explosion finally occurred. Yet, the pure, undeniable certainty of her impending destruction was a warmth that settled deep in my bones. I knew that very soon. The arrogant, wealthy woman sipping wine in Rome would walk up to a heavy oak door, reach for a lock that no longer belonged to her, and feel the solid ground of her reality completely give way to an endless, terrifying freefall. The perfect trap does not snap shut with a loud clang. It closes with the soft, Useless scrape of a brass key sliding into a brand new deadbolt. My wife had spent 30 days basking in the warm Italian sun, completely oblivious to the freezing storm waiting for her on our front porch. She thought she was returning to execute the final, devastating phase of her grand divorce strategy, completely unaware that the real masterstroke had already been played in her absence. I tracked her return from the quiet safety of my coastal cabin. Sitting in my worn armchair with a battered radio, I had rewired myself, listening to the weather reports and flight delays for the major international airport hubs. I knew exactly when Flight 402 touched down on the tarmac. I could vividly picture her walking through the bustling arrival terminal, dragging her heavy, designer leather luggage, her skin glowing with a counterfeit tan paid for by my 40 years of grueling manual labor. She likely hailed an expensive black town car for the hour-long drive back to the wealthy suburbs, typing out one last sickeningly sweet text message to Marcus Vance before settling back into the plush leather seats to rehearse her grand, tearful divorce speech. She honestly believed she was the undisputed director of this stage play, holding all the strings and writing all the dialogue for a foolish, predictable, and exhausted old man. The town car pulled onto our quiet, tree-lined street right around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the exact hour the neighborhood wives were usually out walking their expensive purebred dogs. It was a beautiful, completely cloudless Tuesday. The black car idled at the base of the long gravel driveway. Eleanor stepped out, tipped the driver with a crisp $50 bill from her stolen stash, and turned to face her supposed castle, ready to drop the final curtain on our 30-year masquerade. The very first crack in her pristine reality must have been the silver family minivan parked squarely in her designated spot near the garage. I had always parked my rusted pickup truck on the far left side, leaving the prime, shaded space for her luxury sedan. She probably scoffed as she saw it, arrogant and annoyed, assuming I had foolishly purchased a new vehicle with the last remaining scraps of our joint savings to try and win her back. But as she dragged her heavy suitcases up the familiar concrete walkway, the inconsistencies began to multiply rapidly, tearing massive holes in her perception of reality. A brightly colored plastic tricycle sat abandoned on the perfectly manicured front lawn. A pot of blooming yellow marigolds, a specific flower she actively despised and loudly claimed triggered her delicate allergies, sat prominently on the front porch steps. She reached the heavy oak door, her brow furrowed in deep, arrogant frustration. She dug into her designer handbag, her manicured fingers wrapping confidently around the familiar heavy brass key. She thrust it into the lock and pushed. It jammed immediately. She pulled it out, muttering under her breath about my supposed incompetence, assuming I had broken the lock while hauling heavy equipment and failed to repair it properly. She shoved the key back in, jiggling it violently, the metal scraping harshly against the brand new tumblers the young family had installed the very day they moved in. When the key absolutely refused to turn, her annoyance flared into genuine, righteous anger. She pounded her fist against the thick wood, the heavy thuds echoing sharply across the quiet suburban street. She yelled my name, her voice shrill and demanding, ordering me to open the door immediately and explain the absurd, cluttered mess on the front lawn. The heavy door swung open, but it was not the tired, beaten-down factory worker she expected to find cowering defensively in the grand foyer. Instead, a young, heavily pregnant woman stood in the doorway, a look of profound confusion and mild alarm washing over her face. She was holding a plastic sippy cup and wearing a casual, paint-stained maternity dress, looking out through the screen door at the furious, well-dressed older woman aggressively trying to break into her home. Eleanor froze, her hand still raised in a tight fist, the angry words dying completely in her throat. She stared at the stranger, her mind desperately trying to process the impossible visual information standing right in front of her. She demanded, in a sharp, condescending tone, to know who the young woman was and what exactly she was doing inside her house. The young mother, taking a slow, protective step backward into the hallway, politely but firmly stated that she must have the wrong address. My wife, a woman who had never been told no in her entire pampered, parasitic existence, completely lost her temper. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger at the woman's chest and shrieked that she had lived in this exact house for 30 years, that her husband Arthur was hiding inside, and that if the young woman did not step aside immediately, she was going to call the authorities and have her dragged out in handcuffs. The young mother's polite confusion instantly hardened into defensive, maternal fear. She closed the heavy oak door just enough to block the entrance, her voice trembling slightly but entirely resolute as she informed Eleanor that there was no Arthur living there. She explicitly stated that she and her husband had purchased the property in a completely legal, incredibly fast cash transaction 3 weeks ago from an older gentleman who was moving away permanently. The words hung in the warm afternoon air, heavy and absolutely lethal. Purchased, cash transaction, moving away permanently. Eleanor's mind, sharp and calculating as it was when stealing my money, simply refused to accept the catastrophic reality of those words. The cognitive dissonance was entirely too massive. She lunged forward, grabbing the brass handle of the screen door and attempting to physically force her way into the foyer, screaming that it was a lie, a scam, and a ridiculous, sick joke. The young mother, terrified by the unhinged behavior, slammed the heavy wooden door completely shut, the deadbolt clicking loudly into place. She immediately dialed the emergency services, reporting a hostile, irrational trespasser attempting to break into her home while her toddler slept upstairs. For the next 15 minutes, Eleanor stood trapped on the front porch, her pristine designer luggage surrounding her like the pathetic wreckage of a sinking ship. She paced back and forth, dialing my old mobile phone number over and over again, only to be met with a dead, automated disconnect tone. The sheer panic she had meticulously planned to inflict upon me was now wrapping its icy, unforgiving fingers entirely around her own throat. She looked around, suddenly realizing that several of our wealthy, notoriously nosy neighbors had stepped out onto their manicured lawns. They were standing on their driveways, watching the dramatic, humiliating spectacle unfold with wide, eager eyes. The pristine social standing she prized above all else, the flawless reputation she had built on my dime, was evaporating right alongside her stolen equity. The wail of police sirens shattered the quiet suburban afternoon, completely destroying whatever dignity she had left. 2 black and white patrol cars pulled aggressively into the driveway, their tires kicking up dust and blocking the gravel path. 3 uniformed officers stepped out, their hands resting cautiously on their heavy-duty belts, completely unamused by the wealthy, screaming woman currently having a hysterical public meltdown on a stranger's porch. They approached her carefully, asking her to step away from the door and present her identification immediately. Eleanor, sobbing in a chaotic mixture of absolute rage and terrifying disbelief, thrust her driver's license into the lead officer's hand. She frantically pointed at the printed address as absolute, undeniable proof of her ownership, demanding they arrest the young family inside for squatting, fraud, and breaking and entering. The lead officer, a seasoned veteran who had likely seen every possible flavor of domestic disaster, calmly radioed dispatch to run a rapid, high-priority property records check. The agonizing wait lasted only 3 minutes, but for Eleanor, standing under the glaring sun while her neighbors watched her unravel, it must have felt like an eternity suspended over a blazing fire. The radio clipped to life on the officer's shoulder, the dispatcher's voice entirely cold, mechanical, and objective. The county property records showed a completely clean, legal, and undisputed transfer of title executed exactly 21 days prior. The sole legal owner listed on the previous historical deed, Arthur, had sold the estate entirely free and clear. The officer handed the plastic license back to my wife, his expression hardening into stern, professional indifference. He informed her, in a voice loud enough for the whispering neighbors across the street to hear perfectly, that she was legally trespassing on private property. He explained that according to the strict laws of our state, the inherited property belonged solely to the heir, and the owner had exercised his absolute right to liquidate the asset without requiring any spousal consent. He looked her dead in the eye and told her she had zero legal claim to the house, no right to step foot on the grass, and if she did not remove herself and her massive pile of luggage from the premises immediately, she would be placed under physical arrest for criminal trespassing and disturbing the peace. The absolute magnitude of her destruction finally crashed down upon her shoulders, a crushing physical weight that buckled her knees. The grand, lucrative divorce she had meticulously plotted in her luxury Italian villa, the massive payout she expected to secure her golden years with her secret lover, and the beautiful, comfortable sanctuary she had stolen from me were all completely, undeniably gone. She was a woman without a kingdom, standing on the concrete walkway of a house she no longer owned, publicly humiliated in front of the very people she used to look down upon. But the deepest, most agonizing cut of all was still waiting for her, taped securely to the wood of the front door in a plain white envelope. There is a distinct, agonizing moment when a master manipulator realizes they are not the architect of the game, but merely a discarded pawn on a board they never even saw. As the police officers sternly demanded her immediate departure from the only kingdom she ever knew, her wide, panicked eyes finally landed on the plain white envelope taped securely to the center of the heavy oak door. The young mother, her face still pale with fear, cracked the door just enough to allow the lead officer to peel the tape away and hand the thick envelope to my trembling wife. Eleanor tore into the paper with perfectly manicured, shaking fingers. She unfolded the yellow legal pad, fully expecting a pathetic, begging letter from a defeated husband pleading for a second chance. Instead, she read her own autopsy. Her eyes darted wildly across the neat, deliberate sentences. I detailed the exact date I discovered the $412 in our joint account. I described prying open the hidden firebox, reading the sickening messages to Marcus Vance, and securing the high-resolution photographs of her entire devastating paper trail. The color drained completely from her face as she read the brutal, undeniable truth. The $800,000 from the rapid cash sale of the house was permanently locked away in an offshore trust she could never, ever touch. She would soon discover just how completely a stolen romance shatters when the bank vault slams shut forever. The police officers, lacking any patience for a domestic dispute that did not involve a crime, ordered her to call a taxi immediately or face arrest. She stood on the hot concrete curb, surrounded by her matching Italian leather luggage, weeping uncontrollably as a rusted cab finally pulled up. She gave the driver the address written at the bottom of my letter. The ride took her far away from the manicured lawns and wealthy neighbors, depositing her in the dusty, gravel-paved lot of the cheap storage facility on the very outskirts of town. The facility manager, a bored teenager behind scratched plexiglass, pointed her toward the back row. She dragged her heavy bags through the dirt, her expensive designer heels sinking into the uneven gravel. She slid the single silver key I had provided into the heavy brass padlock. The rusted metal door shrieked violently as she hauled it upward. The smell of damp concrete and mildew hit her instantly. Inside, stacked haphazardly in the suffocating darkness, were 35 identical, cheap cardboard boxes. Her entire opulent lifestyle, her silk dresses, her expensive imported cosmetics, and the heavy gold jewelry she had bought with my stolen sweat, had been indiscriminately shoved into a dark tomb. I knew the ticking clock attached to this metal box would deliver a secondary, crushing blow she was not prepared for. The prepaid rental agreement expired in just 3 days. If she did not produce immediate cash to cover the next month, the facility would auction off her entire existence to the highest bidder. Desperate, hyperventilating in the stifling heat of the storage unit, she pulled her expensive smartphone from her purse. She dialed the only lifeline she thought she had left. Marcus Vance answered on the second ring, his voice smooth and eager, fully expecting to hear that the grand divorce strategy was in motion and her half of the suburban estate was securely in her bank account. Through broken sobs, standing in the dust of her ruined life, Eleanor confessed the absolute truth. She told him the house was gone, The life savings were locked away in a foreign country, and she was currently standing in a cheap storage unit with absolutely nothing to her name but the clothes on her back. The heavy silence on the other end of the line was the most honest thing Marcus had ever offered her. He did not offer comfort. He did not offer to buy her a plane ticket to join him on the West Coast. The smooth, loving tone completely vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating breath of a man realizing his free ride was permanently over. The call disconnected with a sharp click. When she frantically tried to dial him back, her fingers slipping on the glass screen, the automated voice informed her the number was no longer in service. Her high school sweetheart, the man she had funded with hundreds of thousands of dollars of my relentless labor, had abandoned her the very second her pockets turned inside out. She was entirely alone, standing in the dirt, holding nothing but the devastating consequences of her own greed. I did not need to be standing in that gravel lot to feel the absolute, profound satisfaction of that moment. Thousands of miles away, completely insulated from the toxic wreckage of my past, I sat in the sturdy wooden rocking chair on the porch of my coastal cabin. The morning sun was just beginning to break over the dark, churning ocean, painting the endless sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. The freezing sea breeze bit at my cheeks, but I felt nothing but an incredible, enduring warmth deep within my chest. I took a slow sip of my black coffee, listening to the rhythmic crashing of the waves against the rocky shore. I had spent 40 years of my life building a financial fortress for a woman who tried to burn it down with me still inside it. But I had walked out of the smoke entirely unscathed, holding the keys to my own absolute freedom. The heavy, greasy steel of the factory floor was finally washed clean from my hands. I breathed in the sharp, salty air, closed my eyes, and smiled. My debt was paid in full, the scales were perfectly balanced, and the rest of my days belonged entirely to me. Thank you so much for watching this story unfold. If you enjoyed this journey of a man taking back his life and outsmarting the ultimate betrayal, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who appreciates a meticulously planned victory. Drop down into the comments right now and leave the word justice so I know you stayed until the very end. And please, do not forget to hit the hype button so this video can reach more viewers who love an incredibly satisfying, well-earned payoff.